the morning Desmond Ackerley reached across the bed and found it cold. He assumed his wife had gone down early to make his coffee the way he'd trained her to make it. 1 sugar, cream poured before the espresso, never after. He lay there another minute, listening for the grinder. When the house stayed silent, he felt the first thin thread of irritation, the kind that always ended with someone apologizing. He came downstairs in his robe expecting Simone at the island, with her eyes lowered. Instead he found the front door standing open to the June heat, her wedding ring sitting in the center of the marble like a period at the end of a sentence, and a trail of dark drops leading from the kitchen to the empty spot in the garage where her car should have been. He crouched and touched one of the drops. It was blood. It was already dry. He would spend the next several hours doing what powerful men do when the ground moves under them. He called her phone, which rang from inside a kitchen drawer where she'd left it. He called the housekeeper, who wasn't answering. He called a private security firm before he called the police. Because a man like Desmond does not let strangers into his affairs until he's decided how the story should sound. What he did not understand, standing barefoot in 11,000 square feet of Tennessee limestone and imported glass, was that the woman he had spent 6 years breaking had not run in a panic. She had left on a schedule. She was already 200 miles away, and every move he made from that morning forward had been anticipated by someone who knew him better than his own lawyers did. Have you ever watched a man discover, too late, that the person he thought helpless had been 3 steps ahead the entire time? Stay with this one. It doesn't end where you think. To understand how Simone got out, you have to understand how she got in, and to understand that you have to go back 7 years, to a fundraiser in a hotel ballroom in downtown Nashville where she was the smartest person in the room and nobody knew it. She was 26 then, a forensic accountant 3 years out of grad school, the woman the firm sent in when a company's books didn't smell right. She could look at a spreadsheet the way a doctor reads an X-ray and see the fracture nobody had reported. That night she was there to shake hands and bring in clients, wearing a borrowed dress and shoes that pinched, and Desmond Ackerley crossed the entire ballroom to talk to her. He was 39, already a name in the city, the developer whose glass towers were rewriting the skyline, and whose hotels put Nashville on lists that Nashville used to envy. He was handsome in the expensive, well-maintained way of men who treat their own faces as assets. He asked her what she did, and when she told him, he laughed and said most people at these things were trying to sell him something. But she looked like she was quietly counting the exits. She said she was counting the exits. He liked that. That should have been the first thing she noticed. That a man like him liked being seen through. Because it flattered his belief that no one could ever really do it. The courtship was a landslide. He was attentive the way weather is attentive. Flowers to her office, then dinners, then a weekend in Charleston, then a ring after 8 months that made the women at her firm go quiet when she walked in. Her mother, back in a small town in Kentucky, cried on the phone and told her she'd landed the whole world. Her younger sister was more careful, Talia. Not a sister actually, but the woman who'd been Simone's college roommate and had become closer than blood, asked her once, over cheap wine, why a man who could have anyone had chosen the girl who noticed the exits. Simone had laughed it off. She would think about that question for years. What she remembered later was that the control arrived so gradually she mistook each turn of the screw for love. He didn't like the hours her job demanded, so wouldn't it make more sense, with everything they had, for her to step back? She stepped back. He didn't like that her friends pulled her attention, so why not host at the house instead, where he could be part of it? The friends stopped coming. He didn't like the way a certain colleague looked at her at a dinner, and the argument that followed was the first time he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave a mark. He cried afterward. He was so sorry. He said his own father had been a hard man, the kind who'd built the family's first fortune by ruining 3 rival firms and toasting each collapse, and that Desmond had sworn never to be like him, and look, here he was, terrified he'd hurt the only person he loved. She held him while he wept. She was the one who ended up comforting him. That, she would understand much later, was the whole machine in miniature. By the time they married she had let her license lapse. By their 2nd anniversary, she was asking for permission to see her own mother. He controlled the money with the totality of a man who believed money was the only real language. She had a credit card that itemized to his phone. She had a car with a location she didn't know he tracked until the day he recited her afternoon back to her. Every stop, in a voice so calm it made her sick. The mansion had a name. Desmond had named it, the way you name a boat, and 40 rooms, and the strangest loneliness Simone had ever known, which was the loneliness of being watched constantly and seen by no one. The violence, when it came in full, was not the hot, sloppy rage of the movies. That was the thing nobody warned her about. It was administrative. He hit her the way an auditor issues a finding. Because a standard had been violated, because a lesson was owed, because she had, in his framing, chosen this by failing to be perfect. He would explain, afterward, exactly what she had done to require it. He kept his hands off her face when there were events on the calendar and moved to her ribs and her upper arms, the places a dress covered. He was, in his own mind, restrained. He told her so. He said other men would have been worse. He may even have believed that some part of what he did was tenderness. The tenderness of a man perfecting a thing he owned. She learned the geography of survival. She learned that the third stair from the top creaked and that his mood at breakfast forecast the whole day. She learned which brand of concealer held up under the lights of a charity gala and how to smile through a cracked rib so completely that a senator's wife once told her she was the most serene woman in Nashville. She learned to count 41 steps from the master suite to the wine cellar, which had the only lock in the house he couldn't override remotely. 2 minutes for him to lose the thread of his fury once it started, if she said nothing and gave him nothing to push against. She became an expert in a subject with exactly one student. And then, in the 4th year, something in her woke up that he had never accounted for, because he had never once, in all his cataloging of her, remembered what she actually was. She was an accountant, not the decorative wife he'd manufactured, a forensic accountant, trained to find the fracture nobody reported, and she was living inside the largest set of unaudited books in the state of Tennessee. It started small, almost by accident. He'd left his study unlocked one night. He did that when he'd been drinking and felt untouchable. And she'd gone in to close it up before the housekeeper saw the state of it, and her eye, out of old habit, snagged on a stack of wire transfer confirmations. Numbers she wasn't supposed to understand, entities she'd never heard of. A resort development in the Smokies that had been announced with great fanfare, that investors had poured into, that seemed on paper to be swallowing capital and producing nothing but more shell companies in states with friendly secrecy laws. She stood in that study for a long time, and the woman who had spent 6 years being told she was stupid, felt something cold and clear move through her, because she could read this. She could read every line of it. And what it said was that her husband was not just a man who hid his wife. He was a man committing wire fraud and money laundering on a scale that would put him in a federal cell for the rest of his natural life. And he had no idea that the person best equipped in the entire world to prove it was sleeping in his bed with a bruise on her hip. She did not run to the police that week. People ask why. The comments on every story like this are full of it. Why did she wait? Why didn't she just go? So here is the honest answer, the one those stories usually skip. A bruise gets you a restraining order he'll violate by Thursday. A 911 call gets you one bad night in a system that will hand you back to him by the weekend, angrier. She had watched, from inside her marriage, exactly how much a man with Desmond's money could buy. Judges he golfed with, a police captain whose kid's tuition he quietly covered, a public relations firm on retainer whose entire job was making inconvenient facts disappear. If she went to them with a black eye, she would be a hysterical wife, and she would be dead within the month, and nobody would ever prove it. But a federal case built on his own documents, that was a different animal entirely. That couldn't be charmed or bought. That would not care that he owned half the skyline. She didn't choose to stay because she was weak. She chose the long game because she was the only one who understood that it was the only game that could actually win. So she became, in her own house, the ghost auditor of her husband's empire. She was methodical in a way that would later make a room full of FBI agents go quiet with respect. She never took an original. She photographed. She used an old phone Talia had bought with cash and mailed to a P.O. box in a town Simone visited under the cover of a standing hair appointment. She learned his patterns. The study nights, the drinking nights, the trips to see the woman he thought Simone didn't know about. A hotel manager named Colette Rourke who wore Simone's future like a costume and had no idea what she was actually inheriting. Every time Desmond flew to Miami to see Colette, Simone had 36 unwatched hours, and she used them the way a surgeon uses an open chest. She built the financial case first because it was the one he couldn't feel her building. Wire confirmations, shell company registrations, the gap between what investors were told and where the money actually went. $41 million, routed through a chain of entities he'd named, in a private joke to himself, after streets from his childhood neighborhood, which was the kind of vanity that convicts men. She reconstructed his whole architecture of theft from the inside, cross-referenced against public filings she pulled at the library, and she kept 2 copies of everything, one with Talia and one in a safe deposit box under a name that wasn't hers. And she documented the other case too, the one on her body, she photographed every injury against a dated newspaper, the way she'd been trained to preserve a chain of evidence. She kept a journal, not the diary of a sad woman, but the field notes of an investigator, with times and dates and the specific words he used, because his words were confessions. You exist because I allow it. You'll leave here in a box or not at all. He said things like that the way other men complain about traffic, and she wrote down every one, and somewhere in the third year of collecting, she stopped being only his victim and started being the most patient prosecutor he would ever meet. What broke the long game open in the end was that he decided to have a child. He announced it the way he announced developments, over dinner, as a done thing. An heir. He wanted an heir, and Simone would provide one, and something in her. The last small room she'd kept locked even from herself. Understood with perfect clarity that she could not do this. Not because she didn't want a child, because she would not deliver one into his hands, into that house, into a life of watching a small person learn to count the exits. The night she told him carefully that maybe they should wait, he hurt her worse than he ever had, and in the gray hour afterward, lying on the bathroom floor of a house named like a boat, bleeding from a cut above her eye where he'd finally, for the first time, not cared about the calendar, Simone made her decision, not to die. She wants me to be clear about that, the way she was clear with every investigator who ever asked. She did not lie there and give up. She lay there and finished planning. The blood on the marble floor that morning, the blood Desmond crouched over in his robe was hers, from that cut, 4 days old, and she had left it there on purpose. She had cleaned up everything else and left that. A small, precise message from a woman who knew exactly how the story would be read. Let him think the worst. Let him spend his last free days imagining what he'd finally done. It would keep him too rattled to notice the real machine closing around him. The escape itself took 90 seconds and 4 years of preparation. Talia had never been just a friend Simone lost touch with. She'd become, in the decade Simone was disappearing, a volunteer with a domestic violence network that specialized in exactly this, in getting women out of houses that were designed as cages. There was a car in a grocery store lot, keys in the wheel well. There was a bag already packed in a storage unit. There was a route that avoided every camera Simone had spent months mapping in her own driveway. She left the ring because she wanted him to know she'd taken it off with her own hand, and she left the phone because she'd already copied everything off it that mattered, and she drove out of Nashville at 4:40 in the morning, while her husband slept the deep sleep of a man who believed the world was a thing he owned outright. By the time Desmond was calling security instead of the police, Simone was sitting across a folding table from a woman named Marisol Reyes, a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, sliding a flash drive and a bound stack of photographs across a table in a field office in Atlanta, where Talia had driven her, because Simone did not trust a single agency in the state of Tennessee not to be on her husband's Christmas list. Agent Reyes had seen a lot of women walk in with a story. She had not seen many walk in with a case. Simone did not cry. She opened her binder and she talked for 6 hours, and by hour 2 Reyes had called in 2 more agents, and by hour 4 an assistant U.S. attorney named Priya Nair had driven over from her weekend to sit in, and somewhere in there the thing stopped being a domestic complaint, and became one of the cleanest financial fraud prosecutions any of them had ever been handed. Simone had done their job for them. She'd indexed it. She'd cross-referenced it. She had, in the words Nair would use later, built a case a first year could win, and she'd built it while sleeping beside the defendant. Why so much? Reyes asked her, near the end, gesturing at 4 years of a person's life laid out on the table. You had enough to walk out after the first month. Simone thought about it. Enough to leave isn't the same as enough to be safe, she said. He'd have found me. Men like him always find you, unless you take away the thing that makes them powerful. I didn't want a divorce. I wanted him to understand what it feels like to be somewhere you can't get out of. She closed the binder. I wanted him to count the exits. What is more frightening to a man who has never faced a consequence? Losing his money or losing the belief that he's untouchable? Hold that question. He's about to lose both in the same afternoon. Desmond spent 9 days as a free man not knowing. He hired a private investigator to find his wife, which struck Reyes as almost funny when she heard it later. The abuser paying good money to hunt the very evidence that was about to bury him. He told Colette that Simone had abandoned him, played the wounded husband so well he half believed it. He gave a statement to the local police, who fussed and photographed the blood and quietly assumed, as men in that city had been trained to assume about Desmond Ackerley, that whatever had happened, he was the one owed sympathy. He went to a gala on the 5th night and let a society columnist describe him as grief-stricken. He was, for 9 days, exactly the man he'd always been, certain that the narrative would go where he pointed it. The unraveling started, as these things do, with a phone call he didn't expect. His CFO, a nervous man named Wade Halloran, called to see that some accounts had been frozen. Then more accounts. Then Halloran stopped answering, because Halloran had been visited by federal agents and had chosen, wisely, to become extremely cooperative. By the 7th day Desmond's own attorneys were asking him questions in a tone he didn't like, and by the 8th day he sat in his study. The study, the unlocked room, the scene of his undoing, and stared at a subpoena that named entities he'd thought no living person besides himself even knew existed. Streets from his childhood, his private joke in federal print. And that was the moment. Reyes wasn't there to see it, but Halloran was on a call with Desmond when it landed, and Halloran described it later. There was a long silence on the line, and then Desmond said, in a voice Halloran had never heard from him, small and hollow and afraid, "Nobody knew about those. Nobody in the world knew about those but me." And then a silence even longer than the first, because a man that intelligent, however cruel, gets there eventually. Only one other person had ever been inside that study at night. Only one other person had the training to read what was in it. The wife he'd spent 6 years teaching to be stupid had never been stupid at all. She'd been taking notes. They arrested him on a Tuesday at 6:15 in the morning, which had a symmetry Simone allowed herself to appreciate. The same hour she'd once done her counting, now his. Reyes wanted it done at the house in the limestone monument he'd built, and she got her wish. Agents came up the long white drive in a line of dark SUVs, and tracked the June mud across the marble floor where the blood had been. And Desmond Ackerley came down his own grand staircase in a bathrobe for the second time in 9 days. And this time there was no mystery waiting for him at the bottom. There was Marisol Reyes with a warrant and a flat, unimpressed expression, reading him charges that stacked up like the floors of one of his towers. Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and, added by an assistant U.S. attorney who had read every page of a journal kept against dated newspapers, interstate stalking, and a string of assault counts that the state of Tennessee would have found reasons to lose, but the federal government would not. He said what they all say. He said this was a misunderstanding. He said he wanted his lawyer. He said, when he saw them boxing up the study, that whatever they thought they had, it was circumstantial. And Agent Reyes looked at the 40 bankers' boxes of a woman's careful work and said something Simone treasured when it got back to her. "Mr. Ackerley, in 15 years I've never seen anything less circumstantial in my life." The news trucks came for him the way he'd once summoned them for himself. That was the part the city couldn't look away from. Not the fraud, exactly, dry as fraud is, but the other thing, the photographs, the journal, the slow public understanding that the serene woman in the gala pictures had been documenting her own torture in real time, while smiling for the cameras beside him. Nashville had lionized Desmond Ackerley. Now it had to sit with the fact that it had toasted a man at 100 fundraisers, while his wife counted the steps to the only door with a lock. Colette Rourke gave an interview, then stopped giving interviews when it became clear which way the wind was blowing. Wade Halloran testified in exchange for a lesser charge. The empire came down not in a dramatic collapse but in the slow, humiliating way real empires fall. Asset freeze by asset freeze, investor lawsuit by investor lawsuit, until the towers had new names and the mansion sat empty with a bank sign in the yard. The trial took 11 weeks. Simone testified for 3 days. This is the part people always want, and I'll give it to you straight, because she earned the giving of it. She walked into that federal courtroom in a plain gray suit. No makeup covering anything, because there was nothing left to cover. And she sat in the witness box, 6 feet from the man who had promised her 100 times that she would leave their marriage in a box or not at all. And she was not afraid of him. That was the thing that undid him more than any exhibit. He had built his whole self on being the most frightening thing in any room. And she looked at him across that courtroom the way she used to look at a spreadsheet that didn't smell right, with clear, patient, professional attention. And there was nothing in her face he could use. He'd spent 6 years teaching her to be afraid. She'd spent 4 teaching herself not to be, one photograph at a time. Nair walked her through it exhibit by exhibit. The wire transfers. The shell companies named for childhood streets. The $41 million taken from people who'd trusted his skyline. And then the other binder, the one that made a juror in the back row put her hand over her mouth. The dated photographs, the journal in his own recorded words, the emergency room records for injuries he'd made her call accidents. Simone read his own sentences back to the court in a level voice. "You exist because I allow it." She read it the way she'd written it, as evidence, and let the words do to him in public what they'd done to her in private. His defense tried briefly to make her the villain. A calculating woman. A schemer who'd married him for money and manufactured a case when the money went cold. and for about an hour it seemed like it might land, because juries are human and the story of a scheming wife is an old and comfortable one. But then Nair asked Simone a simple question. Why keep two separate cases? Why the fraud and the abuse both? Why not just take the financial evidence and walk away rich in a divorce? And Simone said quietly, into a courtroom that had gone completely still. Because a divorce would have made me his ex-wife. A conviction makes me the last person who ever gets hurt in that house. I didn't do this to get away from him. I did it so the next woman never has to. She looked at the jury, not at Desmond. There's always a next woman. I made sure there wouldn't be. The jury was out for 6 hours. They came back guilty on all 43 counts. Judge Harold Beckman was not a man given to speeches, but he made one at sentencing. He said in his career he had seen greed and he had seen cruelty, but rarely had he seen a defendant who treated both as a hobby, who kept records of the harm he did to his own wife, the way another man might keep a wine collection, as trophies, as proof of a refined and private taste for power. He said the court had considered the defendant's history, his standing, his contributions to the city, and had found that none of it weighed a single ounce against $41 million in fraud, and a woman's catalogued years of terror. And then he gave Desmond Ackerley 31 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole, and ordered restitution that would consume every asset he had left, and told him that he would be an old man, if he lived, before he saw the outside of a wall again. Desmond turned to look at Simone as they took him out. Whatever he was looking for in her face, mercy, or fear, or the small woman he'd built, it wasn't there. She held his eyes until he was through the door, and then she let out a breath she'd been holding, some part of her, for 6 years, and Talia's hand found hers in the gallery, and that was the last time Simone Ackerley ever laid eyes on the man in person. She did not become a symbol overnight, and she'll tell you she never wanted to be one. But the case was too clean and too public to stay quiet. And letters started coming, forwarded through the network, from women all over the country who'd read what she did, and recognized their own kitchens, their own counted steps, their own husbands who kept their hands off the face when there were events on the calendar. So she took the settlement money that came back to her from the wreckage of his empire. Not a fortune, after restitution, but enough. And she started a foundation. Not a glossy one with galas, a practical one. It pays for the thing that almost stopped her. Forensic help. Accountants and investigators who work, quietly and for free, with women trying to build the kind of case that can't be charmed or bought. Because Simone learned in the worst possible way that leaving isn't the same as being safe, and that the fastest way to make a powerful man powerless is to take away the belief that no one is smart enough to catch him. She uses her maiden name now. She let her license get reinstated. She works, when she works, on exactly the kind of books that don't smell right, and she is very, very good at it. And every so often she sits across a folding table from a woman who's just walked out of a house that was built as a cage, and she opens a binder, and she says the thing she wishes someone had said to her at 26. You're not stupid, and you're not trapped, and I have counted more exits than he could ever imagine. People ask her sometimes whether she forgives him. She doesn't answer that, because it's the wrong question, and she was always precise about questions. Forgiveness is a thing you give a man who's lost his power over you. And Desmond Ackerley lost his power over her the morning. She left a single drop of her own blood on his marble floor and drove into the dark, with everything he'd ever done written down in her own careful hand. The last woman hurt in that house made sure she was the last one. And somewhere in a federal facility, an old man who once owned a skyline is learning, cell by cell and year by year, the one thing his wife already knew by heart. Exactly how many steps it is to a door you can't open, and exactly how long a life can feel when every single one of them is counted for you.